We must go back to 1939. I was 19 years old at that time, and I went to Loreto, where I had been invited to go for a course along with other Catholic students. I went, but I don't remember anything about the course. I only remember that during the breaks between one talk and another, I ran to the little house of Loreto, where they say the family of Nazareth lived. I didn't have time to consider whether the story was historically true. I found myself there on my knees, close to those darkened walls in the little house of Nazareth, which is inside a larger church built like a fortress. I was immediately overcome by a great emotion, by a great desire to cry. I was taken by something I would define today as divine, and I felt that the divine was crushing me. I thought, Mary must have crossed the room from here to there. Perhaps Saint Joseph made these beams. These walls must have heard the sound of Jesus' voice. And the more I thought about these things, the more I felt crushed by this something divine that overpowered me. Then I would return to the talks, but as soon as I got a break, I would go back to the little house, and each time I had the same experience. It was as if the little house of Loreto, as if that family of Nazareth had something to do with me. I remember that we all went into that beautiful church the last day. I was standing at the back, and at a certain moment, I had a very clear sensation. It was as if someone was saying to me, "You will be followed by a multitude of virgins." I returned home. At that time I was teaching. One day I met the pastor of the town. He saw I was very happy and he asked me, "Has something happened? Have you found your way?" I replied, "Yes." He asked, "Are you getting married?" "No." "Are you going to enter the convent?" "No." "Then you will stay at home and not get married?" "No." These were the 3 ways available to young people at that time. I understood in that moment that it was a 4th way, but I was not able to describe it. All I knew was that it had something to do with the little house of Loreto, with the family of Nazareth, with many virgins, 2 virgins with Jesus in the midst. I was in Trent then. I was teaching in another valley and still studying. I was studying philosophy. I remember that one day I was at home with my little sisters and it was cold outside, terribly cold. We were rather poor and my mother asked one of us to go and get some milk. She didn't ask me because my parents wanted me to concentrate on my studies. She asked my sisters, who, poor things, weren't very enthusiastic about going because it was very cold. In that moment, I felt an urge to make an act of love. I said, "Mama, I'll go." I took the bottle and I went for the milk. The farm that sold milk was about 1.5 kilometers away. I remember that when I was halfway there, I stopped. I became aware of something. At that moment, though nothing extraordinary happened, I had the impression that heaven opened up and a voice from above said to me, "Give yourself completely to me." I understood that it was the call, a call to give myself completely to God, to choose God as the ideal of my life. When I returned home, I wrote a letter to my confessor, who immediately wanted to see me in order to explain this to me and to prepare me, to make me aware of all the difficulties I would come up against. Among the other things he said, "Your sisters will get married, your brother will get married, and you'll remain alone for the rest of your life. You'll be alone." But I thought to myself, for as long as there is a tabernacle, I will never be alone. He saw I was very convinced, and so a few days later, he sent me a letter telling me that on the day before the Feast of the Immaculate Conception, 1943, I should go to the church where everything would be prepared, so that I could give myself completely to God. That morning on the eve of the Immaculate Conception, I remember it was very cold and there was a storm too. I walked holding my umbrella in front of me so that I could go ahead. I reached the top of the hill where the little church stood. The priest had prepared a kneeler in front of the altar. He asked me to take my place at the kneeler and the Mass began. I brought a small missal with me, which was customary at that time. It was very nice and small and in Latin. I followed the Mass with the missal, and then just before communion, the moment came for me to pronounce the formula of my total consecration to God. I said it, but before doing so, I suddenly understood what I was doing. I was 23 years old. I was young, still studying. I was leaving everything. Not so much studies or work, but the world. I was leaving the world. In realizing this, I remember that at that moment a tear fell. I had the impression that a bridge was falling behind me, and it's true. I would never be able to return to the world. On my way home, with the few coins I had, I bought 3 red carnations. Now, those who give themselves to God forever in our movement still put red carnations in front of that same crucifix that I had used when I prayed for a couple of hours the night before my own consecration. I went home. It was a secret, of course, between me and my spiritual director. But it was such a contagious joy that my companion, who had come for lessons in philosophy, immediately realized that something had happened. Of course, we started talking and the secret came out. Shortly afterwards, she too expressed the desire to do as I had done. Then I met the other girls. They told me that they wanted to do the same. And this is how the first group of Focolare was formed, all given to God. This was on December 7th, 1943. Time passed and we came to May 13th, 1944. There was a very big, terrible bombardment in Trent. When we heard the alarm, my whole family ran for shelter to the woods outside the city. That night we slept there in the woods. There was a starry sky, I remember, but I was suffering terribly because I knew that I wouldn't be able to leave the city with them. I had to continue my contacts with the newly born movement, with these companions of mine. Instead, I had understood that my family would have to leave, and I was the only one working and supporting my family. How could I tell my mother and my father that I wouldn't be able to leave with them in the morning? And so I kept crying, and my mother tried to console me. "You'll see," she said, "everything will be fine." We were all lying on the ground under the trees, and I kept looking up at all those stars. All I remember that night was stars and tears. In fact, we call it the night of stars and tears. When morning came, we began to walk towards our house. We could already see from a distance that the house had been hit. In fact, bombs had fallen all around, and the interior of the house had crumbled. I was the first to climb up into the house, because at this point, I had already decided even to die out of love for God. I went up first so that nothing would happen to my relatives. Then they came in after me. I went up to my father and said, "Dad, I can't leave. I promised God that I wouldn't leave." "I give you my blessing," he said. And my father wasn't a religious man. Then I went to my mother, convinced that she, who was a very religious person, would say the same thing. "But you," she said, "you're really ruining everything." She used rather strong words. But I couldn't leave. When they set out toward the mountains early next morning, and I had to put the mountain sack that I was supposed to carry on my mother's curved shoulders, I could hardly bear it. However, I watched them go towards the mountains without even knowing where they would go. I went towards the city. The war had already destroyed everything. It was a disaster. Trees had fallen onto the street. The St. Clair's hospital also had been hit, and there were many victims. As I was going towards the city, all of a sudden, a woman came up to me. She took me by the shoulders and shouted, "4 of my family have died! 4 of my family have died!" In that moment, I understood that I had to put aside all my small suffering in order to take upon myself the suffering of humanity. I kept on walking, searching for my companions to see if they were still alive or buried under the debris. I looked for them, and I found them all. No one had been killed. So then we started looking out for a place to stay. We found a small apartment made up of 2 rooms, and we began to live there. Of course, the war continued and the bombs kept falling. We had to take refuge in the closest air raid shelters. We couldn't take anything with us to the air raid shelters, but I had put a small copy of the Gospel in my pocket. So while I was there with my companions, waiting until it was safe to go outside, we opened the Gospel and read. And there, something absolutely new happened. Those words, which we had read so many times before, had heard so many times from the pulpits, appeared to be extraordinarily new. They were filled with light. We understood that those words could be put into practice at once. They were universal words, made for every man, woman, and child, for everyone. They were eternal words for all times, therefore also for our times. And we took one sentence, for example, love your neighbor as yourself. We wondered, who is our neighbor? Oh, it's that lady there, that poor woman, that other elderly lady. So you can go to her, you can go to the other, you can accompany her home, you can carry those children, you can buy some food. And when the alarm ended and there was no longer any danger of bombs, we went outside to help all those who were suffering. There were people who were wounded, sick, women waiting for their husbands who never returned, orphans. We went out trying to help our neighbor, all kinds of neighbors. They came to our small apartment too, and they ate at our table. There was a focolarina and a poor person, a focolarina and a poor person. Words like, whatever you did to the least, you did to me, made us extremely happy. We can love Jesus continually. Whatever you do to the least, you did it to me, you did it to me, you did it to me. The universal judgment came into evidence here, where Jesus says, I was naked and you clothed me, I was hungry. We did it to Jesus, you did it to me. The war continued, and we wondered, how can we love? How can we truly have God as our ideal? How can we love Him truly with all our heart? Because the war was a tremendous lesson for us. It explained to us that everything is vanity of vanities, that everything passes. It's the lesson that the war gives now too, in the world. In fact, we understood, because at that time I was studying in Venice, but I wasn't able to go ahead with my studies, which was my ideal. Another wanted to get married, but she couldn't because her fiancé never returned from the front. Another wanted to enjoy her beautiful house, but it was hit by bombs. We saw all our youthful ideals shattered. In fact, I said to my companions, is there an ideal that doesn't crumble, that no bomb can destroy? Within me, I felt the answer was, yes, there is. It's God. And so among us girls, we said, let's make God the ideal of our life. Then we asked ourselves, how can we do this practically speaking? How can we do this? We understood that in order to love God, we had to do His will. Doing God's will was a way to holiness, open to everyone, especially to us lay people. A mother must be a good mother, a student a good student. We understood that in this way, we become holy. But then we asked ourselves, is there a will of God that Jesus likes in a special way? I remember that we opened the Gospel and found, love one another as I have loved you. No one has greater love than to lay down his life for his friends. So we looked at one another and said, all right, I'm ready to die for you. And I for you. I want to be ready to die for you. All of us were ready to die for each other. None of us died, but we could die to ourselves by beginning to put our things in common, to live a communion of goods. If I had 2 jackets, I gave one to the others. If I had 2 pairs of gloves, I gave 1 pair away. We could also share our worries. We needed to feed half of Trent, and all kinds of things arrived. Sacks of flour, powdered milk, which was used during the war. Jams, eggs. The corridor of my house was full. People brought all these things to us and we gave them away to the poor of the city. Other words that struck us in the Gospel were those words where Jesus makes promises. We read, give and gifts will be given to you. How often we experience this. We were at home one morning and we had only 1 egg in the house. We had nothing else to eat and there were 6 or 7 of us. A poor woman came to the door and asked for something. I looked at the others and said, we have only 1 egg. Well, let's give it. We gave the egg and on the same day a dozen eggs arrived. On another occasion, the same thing happened with potatoes. With all that we needed, give and gifts will be given to you. Give and gifts will be given to you. The same thing happened with other promises of Jesus. For example, ask and you will obtain. Once there was a poor man who said to me, I need a pair of shoes. I need to walk. I need a pair of shoes size 12. So I went into a church and I asked Jesus, give me a pair of shoes size 12 for you in a poor man. I went outside and right at the door, a young lady I knew handed me a package. A pair of men's shoes size 12. One day, we were in a cellar. We lit a candle and I opened the Gospel and I found Jesus' prayer, Father, may all be one. We read it. We felt that we were born for that page of the Gospel. That is, for unity, to bring unity into the world, unity with God and unity among all brothers and sisters. But how could we bring unity? Well, we had already understood by loving one another so that Christ would be in our midst. I'll tell you another episode. One day, one of my companions was in bed with rash all over her face. She had gone to visit a poor lady. She washed her floor, cleaned her house, and probably caught an infection. A priest came to bring her communion. I was there too, and he asked me, do you know when Jesus suffered the most? I had learned that he had suffered the most in the Garden of Olives, and so I said, "In the Garden of Olives." He replied, "No, Jesus suffered the most on the cross when he cried out, 'My God, why have you forsaken me?'" Then the priest left, and I said to my companion, "Did you hear that? Listen, we have only one life. Let's spend it well. Let's follow Jesus, certainly crucified, but in that cry, in his abandonment." We immediately began to see his face everywhere, in all those who suffered, who resembled him, in divorced women because they were alone, in orphans because they were alone, in those who were abandoned, and we tried to love him even more than before because we saw his face in all these people. But what struck us most about him was the thought that in that moment he had truly lost everything. He was dying. He had lost his physical health. He had lost his disciples who were not there except for John. He had lost his mother because he had given her to us. He had lost everything. He still had the very consoling presence of his Father who was one with him. And yet the Father asked him for this too, and he cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" In 1948, along with the Women's Focolare House, which had multiplied, the first Men's Focolare began. A young electrician who had come to our Focolare heard us speaking about our ideal while he was fixing the light. He became interested in what we were saying and felt called to live the same way of life. He said to us, "I would like to follow your way." So he looked for a place to stay and found a former poultry shed. Together with another young man, they transformed this chicken shed and began a Men's Focolare House.
Then many other people came, of all age groups, races, cultures, from workers to politicians, priests and families, young people, teenagers and children, many belonging to different churches and people professing different religious faiths who want to contribute to building universal brotherhood. They are many branches of one tree, thousands of stories like episodes of one big story. It is the story of a new people born from a young woman who, one day, said yes to God.